Welcome to Sound of Resistance channel. Ukrainian President Zelensky is locked in his most critical target in Ukraine. All Russian fronts in the south of the country were besieged by Ukrainian warriors. Russian soldiers are looking for a way out to save their lives from the coming Ukrainian attack. The Russian army has been experiencing a shortage of weapons and ammunition in Ukraine for the past month. The stocks of weapons in the arsenal of the Russian army are about to run out. In addition, the Ukrainian army is blocking the weapon aid that will come to the Russian army. The Ukrainian army managed to control almost all the means of aid that could come to the Russian army. The Russian army continues to be ineffective in Ukraine. Russia is trying to reach a helping hand for its soldiers who are bored in Ukraine. If Russian leader Putin cannot provide armed support to the Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine, this will bring the collapse of the Russian army. Aware of this, Russian President Vladimir Putin is looking for a wall to lean on. Russia is trying to strengthen its bilateral relation with Iran. Russia continues to attack Ukrainian cities with the UAVs it's bought from Iran. Putin needs more weapons and military equipment to continue his attack in Ukraine. For this reason, Putin accelerated his search for allies. While Russian leader Putin is trying to eliminate the factors that caused his defeats in Ukraine, he is also struggling with the sound of uprising in Russia. After his unsuccessful results in Ukraine, Putin is getting a great reaction in Russia. While the walls of the Kremlin echoed with the voice of Putin's resignation, the anti-Putin Russian people showed their reactions to Putin by taking to the streets. Putin has no branch left to hold on to in Russia. No one in Russia trusts each other. Putin completely lost his confidence in Russia due to setbacks that arose as a result of his wrong decisions in Ukraine. The Russian leader, on the other hand, complains about the traitors inside. Putin could not turn his back on anyone in the Kremlin. Russian dissidents lined up to stab Putin in the back. Cracked voice began to rise in the Russian army against Putin. Noting that the Russian commanders could not display a good example of leadership in Ukraine, the Russian soldiers expressed that they complain about the frivolous attitude of the Russian commanders. Among those in the Russian army who continue to react to Putin, the majority consists of newly mobilized soldiers. Russian reserve soldiers who started to work in Ukraine complained that the conditions on the Russian fronts are very heavy. Russian reservists stated that they had difficulty in meeting even their necessities that are necessary to continue their lives. Russians who harbor anger and grudge against Russian leader Putin continue to increase. It cannot be said that the Russian leader did not pay much attention to heavy criticism made about him. Putin has turned his full attention to the south of Ukraine. The defeat of Putin's army in southern Kherson would mean the collapse of the Russian army. With the victory of Ukrainian army in Kherson, the recovery of the occupied areas by the Russian army will accelerate. The preparations for the offensive by the Ukrainian army in the south of the country threatens all the territory of Ukraine, which Russia has won since 2014. It's only a matter of time before Russian President Putin faces a nightmare in the south of Ukraine. A former US general said the Ukrainian counteroffensive was slowly advancing towards Crimea. The fall of the Russian army in Ukraine continues to be studied extensively since the beginning of the war. Vladimir Putin's troops failed to seize the capital Kiev and then in September lost their piece of land near Kharkov. In April, Russia's main naval ship was sunk in the Black Sea by the Ukrainian forces. Desperate to avoid further embarrassment, Russian troops are now defending their holdings in Kherson in South Ukraine and areas in the east. But Ben Hodges, the former commander of the US Army Europe, believes that Russia is ready to lose all territory it has won since 2014. This means Ukraine retakes Crimea, which was annexed by Russia in 2014. The most important key point in the success of Ukrainian army's winning streak that will extend the Crimea is the suitability of the weapons and equipments to be used in the attack on the Russian fronts. Arsenal on the Ukrainian army consists of the state-of-the-art modern weapons. The biggest explanation for the victory of the Ukrainian army over the Russian soldiers is its superiority in weapon technology. One of the most important weapons in the arsenal of the Ukrainian army is HIMARS, High Mobility Artillery Rocket System. HIMARS is the key for the Ukrainian fighters to regain control of the south of the country. Ben Hodges, former commander of the US Army Europe, made striking statements about HIMARS owned by the Ukrainian army. Mr. Hodges said, "The Ukrainian army is moving its HIMARS to Kherson for its possible attack." The Ukrainian army said that HIMARS will be the defensive factor for the winter of the attacks. Hodges, the Ukrainian fighters, HIMARS and Kherson will probably fall in the next 3-4 weeks. In addition, Ukraine said that after Kherson regains its dominance, it will direct its attacks on the other flank of the country towards Donetsk. The Ukrainian army's biggest target after Kherson is Crimea. If the Ukrainian warriors can get the Russians' nightmare HIMARS into the area and range, then it's just met. The devastating effects of the attack by the Ukrainian forces will be enormous. HIMARS is a lightweight multiple rocket launcher developed for the US Army in the 90s, usually mounted on a truck allowing forces to hit targets from longer range. Hodge added that Russia's logistics systems were done at this stage of the war, and this will make its attacks on Ukraine less effective. I believe that Ukraine will liberate Crimea by the summer, because we talked about who has the supreme will. The logistical situation of the Russians in Ukraine is terrible, said Hodge. The Kerch bridge on the Crimean route was damaged. The Russians are now trying to improve the route through Mariupol to resupply their troops in southern Ukraine, he said. Ben Hodge, the former commander of the US Army Europe, added, Russia's logistics systems were already weak and exhausted before this. Now they are adding about 200,000 Russian soldiers, which will be just another burden. The Ukrainians have been targeting the Russian logistics system intelligently for months. While the Ukrainian system has always been, he said, he was getting better last week. Logistics is not only the issue hurting Russia's military efforts. Low morale among Russian soldiers was also a reported source of problems during the war. News on Friday claimed that Russian forces are now threatening to shoot their own men if they try to withdraw. The Russian Ministry of Defense said in an intelligence update, due to low morale and unwillingness to fight, Russian forces have likely begun deploying barrier troops or intercepts units. The report, shared by the Russian Ministry of Defense, stated that this probably evidenced the low quality, low morale and discipline of the Russian forces. As Russia prepares to defend Kherson, the Kremlin signaled that its troops might well be withdrawn, and a source close to the halls of a power said this week. But Ukraine is fed up with such comments, as it could be a trap to try to put Ukraine troops at a disadvantage. The Ukrainian army does not act hastily when attacking the areas occupied by the Russian army, but is carefully to be cautious. Natalia Humeniuk, spokesperson for Ukraine's Southern Military Command, said this week, this may be a manifestation of a certain provocation to create the impression that settlements are abandoned, that it's safe to enter them while preparing to settle. The Ukrainians are content to make slow but consistent progress near Kherson for now. According to US military figures, the Ukrainian army is confident that they can retake the city. US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said in a speech at the Pentagon in Washington this week that Ukraine can do just that. As to whether the Ukrainians can take the remaining lands on the western bank of the Dnieper and in Kherson, I believe they certainly have the capacity to do so, said US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. Above all the Ukrainian-Russian war, Ukrainians believe they have the capacity to do so. We saw that they made a very methodical but effective effort to reclaim their sovereign lands. With the victories they won against the Russian army, the Ukrainians convinced the whole world that they would emerge victorious from this war. Thank you for watching us.